Welcome to the 64th episode of Dialogika, a podcast between two friends about the latest in politics, society, and feminism in Indonesia and the world. I'm Stephanie Tangkilisan.
And I'm Sweden Lee. And this week, we're talking about the second presidential debates.
Yay!
Which is already so much better.
We're gonna cover in case you've missed it, what the candidates actually said on
infrastructure, energy, food, and all those fun bits. They actually talked about some substantive things.
Yay! And besides this short recap, we're also gonna give our opinions on what they said. And here's to it. Just for a comment clarification, I think me and Sweden are still undecided in our choices. But we did have a comment that we supposedly sound very pro-Prabowo, which I don't know if you know either of us, but that's not accurate.
I'm not going to name the commenter on SoundCloud. Like, you can find it out yourself. But I'm glad you brought it up so that we can talk about our views and where we're coming from.
Clarify. Yeah. I think for us, it's also just trying to be fair and point out that, especially when you're talking about human rights, Prabowo has received a lot of criticism over that, and deservedly so, but we can't absolve Jokowi from human rights criticisms, and I think sometimes there's a lot of hypocrisy on the left about precluding Jokowi from criticisms on human rights because he didn't actually perpetrate it himself, but his cabinet is full of people who did. And under his presidency, he did curtail the human rights of various activists, especially Papuan activists, significantly. And there are significant evidence to show that there are various violations of human rights in his term in office. Especially as someone who is currently the president, you need to criticize what he's currently doing, not just what happened in the past, but how the precedent that he have done so far will continue to affect the country in the next 5 years.
Especially in the circumstances, in the context of a debate, of literally you're talking about these two candidates and what they will bring to the next 5 years. You gotta look at it at a fair perspective. I think both Stephanie and I uphold the office of the president to a higher standard.
Yeah.
And as part of that discussion, you've got to ask the hard questions. I think it's only fair for us to talk about them genuinely in that sense and not just talk about because we might be more progressive leaning that we're already going to prejudice our analysis or our discussions towards the more progressive leaning candidate. I think we have to be fair.
Yeah. But thanks for your comments. We really appreciate it. And so on to the second debate. What are your first impressions?
It's so much more substantive, and they're actually talking about policies and numbers, some false numbers, but still numbers.
Yeah.
It's just so much more chill. Less dramatic.
It's a lot more chill. It's still very Indonesian. Kayak pakai undian gitu.
Yeah, but in a way that's almost it's no longer show for show's sake, right?
Yeah, and it takes a lot less time, and the fact that it's only Jokowi and Prabowo on the stage allows, I think, more back and forth between them.
Yeah.
And the format, I think, also allows more back and forth between them.
Yeah.
It's not perfect. I wish, they're actually given more time instead of 1 minute, minute and a half or 2 minutes to actually, answer and respond. Or because I think what's fun about the debate is the back and forth, right? It's not a space for people to just state what they want and then what the other person state what they want, which is, part of it, and is important, but you want to see them fight on issues, not physically. Who do you think would fight in a physical fight, Jokowi or Prabowo?
Prabowo would definitely throw the first punch. He's the more emotional of the two.
I feel like Prabowo also has just generally more fighting skills physically since he was in the military.
He was in the military.
He is older. He is older though, and Jokowi seems sprightly and fast.
Yeah, I think Jokowi is gonna be one of those fighters that's gonna avoid your punches and then just wait till you're tired.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
You're talking about the format, right? And this reminded me, and I will say that like I'm very biased in this perspective just because of the work that I do and the fact that I live in America right now. It reminded me of like the town hall style debates.
Yeah, it did. They weren't on like one podium. They were kind of sitting and then in a bar stool and stuff.
Yeah, and I hope that we will be able to still continue that throughout the subsequent debates, because I think the first format was so rigid.
Mm-hmm.
It was very much like stand behind your podium,
mm-hmm.
And respond in like these very structured ways that it didn't allow the back and forth that you said is much more interesting. And I feel like you actually get more out of the candidates because you go beyond their talking points, right? If you go back and forth, you actually have to push through what they want to say in the first place and see if there's any substance underneath.
Right.
For our listeners who did not listen to the debate or are not entirely sure what this round of debates are about, this second round of presidential debates is focusing on infrastructure, environment, natural resources, energy, and food. So a lot of the core economic and industry-focused topics that was not covered, obviously, in the first round of debates.
But it is kind of the topic that involves the day-to-day lives of most Indonesians and more Indonesians.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to see how these two converge and diverge in that opinion. So why don't we start with the first topic?
Infrastructure. So obviously, Jokowi, as the incumbent, who's been in power for 4 years now, has a lot of data and a lot of stats to back up his claims that his government and his administration has done a lot of work in terms of building roads, fixing up a lot of villages and connecting villages all across this archipelago that is our nation.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that, if anybody who follows Jokowi's Instagram account like I do...
You do?
He loves to tout his... I do. Just to see what's up.
All right.
He loves to tout his infrastructure projects. He's always pictured wearing a hard hat, like traveling down a lonely toll road that has just been opened.
That must be a good job to be Jokowi's photographer.
Hey,
travel Indonesia. Anyway,
it's fun.
Yeah.
But I do think, at least from my cursory glance of it, that Jokowi is one of those presidents who have tried hard to create infrastructure beyond Java, right? Beyond just like Jakarta.
His idea is that, he instituted this really giant infrastructure projects, connecting roads in Papua, connecting roads in Sumatra, and just trying to and by creating roads, his plan is that it will lead to increased connectivity, which will allow the transport of goods and services for much cheaper and spur economic growth in a more fair way across the country and not just Java.
Yeah.
And there is, definitely merits to that plan because Indonesia, especially in the smaller regions, I've experienced this. I've traveled across Indonesia and the roads in different places is just something that you had a smooth road for, that if it's a smooth, good road, it will take 2 hours, can become 8 hours. And then this makes it impossible, and it's really bumpy, so it's makes it really hard to transport cement, for example, that is necessary to build houses and factories and stuff, and just makes prices. I think there was a study a couple years ago before all of the different stuff. Cement prices in Jakarta would be $4, $3 or $4. And cement prices for a bag of cement in Papua in a more remote place would be $15,000 per bag.
Wow. Just because there are no roads.
Yeah, there are no roads, so it would have to be airlifted or
ships or whatever.
Just this really it just makes it ridiculous. So that's really important, and I think Jokowi has done a good job in. I really like the intent and I really like the efforts put in it. But Prabowo does bring, and not just Prabowo, but a lot of people have been raising concerns about the fact that a lot of these giant infrastructure projects are funded by foreign loans.
Yeah.
So Indonesia is dramatically increasing its foreign debt and that kind of stuff. And he uses a lot of Chinese contractors and loans. Which is happening all over the world, right? You have the Chinese building roads and ports in Africa and South America, and if they can't pay it, the Chinese will take over that port. So there needs to be caution in, and what Prabowo said was, to find out whether or not these contracts are feasible to be paid back, and
feasibility studies.
Whether these contracts, if a giant infrastructure project is good, but what would be the best, most affordable way for us to do that in a way that doesn't saddle the burden on future generations?
Mm-hmm. Which is a classic sort of conundrum for any kind of developing country, right? Like, you want to develop fast, you want to build these. What we, as people who live in cities and who live in the capital cities, especially, like, we take it for granted that roads are always there. The fact that we have bad roads is already a good thing because for some communities, they don't even have bad roads; they have no roads.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a dirt road or something.
Yeah, so it is one of the most basic elements of infrastructure, but just building roads and building highways and building connectivity can give so much to a community. I guess what I'm saying is that it's a delicate balance, because you do want to make these infrastructure projects big and ambitious and get it quickly done. Mm-hmm. But to do it responsibly is not necessarily an easy thing.
Right. I mean, I think it's completely fair and I think it's probably the right thing to do for Jokowi to get foreign aid help and foreign loan help for building these infrastructure projects, because we don't have enough money and resources to actually build that. Like, we don't have enough budget or anything to create all of these projects. And, there's something to be said about the sooner the better, because that's impacting people's lives now.
Yeah.
It's just the question, and we're not completely experts in evaluating how good his general infrastructure projects are. Mm-hmm. But, it's I think the problem is not getting foreign aid. The problem is how are these projects prioritized and allocated, right?
And to make sure that these kind of projects don't just become as Prabowo mentioned, right, in his criticism of Jokowi, you don't want these infrastructure projects to just become monuments or, emblems of your administration, but not actually useful. Which I think is a fair criticism of any kind of infrastructure project. Mm-hmm. It should be functional and beneficial. Otherwise, you're going to end up World Cup stadiums, right? In those World Cup countries where they built the thing thinking that it'll serve the community, and then it's just a ghost. It's a ghost building or a ghost project. Shall I move on to the next topic?
Yeah. What's the next topic?
Well, the next topic is a pretty heated one because it's about the environment.
Oh, yeah.
And, I think anybody who's been following Indonesian news about the environment has probably heard a lot about the forest fires.
Yeah.
It's been happening almost on an annual basis. Jokowi made one of the most controversial comments of the night when he said, over the past 3 years, there have been no forest or peat fires.
Yeah.
Which is false. For all of us who've lived in Jakarta, and then for anybody who's lived in Singapore or Malaysia, they can all attest that for the last 3 to 5 years, there has been forest fires. Mm-hmm. The scale of the forest fires has decreased. This was the director of Greenpeace Indonesia has came out with a statement saying that what Jokowi said was wrong. There is forest fires. Right. The amount of forest fires has decreased during Jokowi's time. And Jokowi actually, on Monday after the debate, clarified his statement saying that it's not about there are no forest fires, it's that we are better able to manage it.
I feel like that's a big difference. And yes. It seems like kind of a mistake that shouldn't have been made.
Oh, yeah.
It's not a small statistical mistake. It's a mistake that's it's a binary question, right? It's yes or no forest fires exist or not exist. And he should have known that this is I think he just hopes that for the most part, people won't fact check him and believe him.
Yeah. Shout out to Kompas and Tempo. Their Instagram and Twitter accounts have done a really good job fact checking the statements. I was following it as I was following the debate, and I was like, wow, you guys do a good job making sure nothing gets brushed aside. And I think for Jokowi, it would have been such a power statement, right, to say that like during my administration there has been no forest fires. I think that's what he wanted to say. It's like I fixed one of the most contentious issues in Indonesian foreign relations. But that's not true, right? Like he's decreased the amount of forest fires through regulation and enforcement, but it's still happening, and it's still something that needs to be contended with for any presidential candidate in the future.
I mean, and there's also a variety of reasons why it has decreased this year. And in the last few years, like internationally, there's been a greater scrutiny on companies and their contractors who are doing bad land practice usage. So like forest fires are caused by like slash and burn policy. So, and to make space for palm oil and palm trees, you just like burn existing shrubbery or any kind of plants that are currently in that space, and that's how you clear it instead of digging it out, which is more expensive and takes longer. Which leads to like wildfires and all these different consequences. That's one factor. Like there's so many NGOs and environmental organizations that do the hard work of doing this. And monitoring and then filing sanctions. And one of the biggest thing is that like Jokowi was also saying that under his administration, there have been more lawsuits that were upheld or lawsuits that like punish companies that are doing unfair environmental practices.
Yeah, as you said, what Jokowi has done is already a lot better than what previous administrations, such as the SBA administration, has done about forest fires. The fact that Jokowi is not afraid to go and pursue the sanctions and hit out at the palm oil companies, that's already a big deal. Whether or not it's going to be as productive as we all want it to be, that's almost like a different debate. But the fact that there's appetite for it,
right? The intent is there, and they're pulling it through, which is great.
Good job. I mean, I think for me though, it's like the reason why I wanna, I guess for some people, nitpick on what Jokowi is saying and sort of like what his administration is doing is because there's so much potential, right? Like they have the political will. Now, whether or not they have the political strength to go through with some of these things is what we want them to have. I hold him to a higher standard.
I think part of the discussion was also about land distribution. So how going forward, Jokowi proudly says that under his administration, they've given away land to ordinary farmers and people who actually use the land and given certificates to own it. And then, that like Prabowo's response was that this is a good 1 or 2 generational kind of choice, because people now can benefit from it, but what will happen in the future for people who don't have land? So it's actually better for the state to maintain hold of this. To which Jokowi said, yeah, because you're just a huge giant landowner yourself. Yeah.
In Kalimantan, in East Kalimantan, and in Central Aceh.
Yeah. Of which Prabowo said, oh yeah, but at least it's better than have it being foreign owned because I'm a nationalist and a patriot.
And I will give it back if they want it. But yeah.
Yeah. At any time, because it's a hak guna usaha, so it's the right to use. It's not it's not an ownership right.
Yeah.
That's another thing in Indonesian. Important things to know about Indonesia, that there are various land usage categories, of which I actually know something about because I've dealt with this in my previous job. So there are different kind of categories, like there's different kinds of certificates of land ownership, like there's hak guna bangun, which is the right to own and build on top, and then the right to use, in which you can just use the land and develop it, but you can't really like build crazy structures on it or whatever. And usually these certificates have a term use, so there are contracts of like 10, 15 years, or if there's different like terms for it, and then it will be returned to the government, or it will be tendered again. The tender is the process of which different companies submit their proposal and why they are the best people to use the land. And the result of this is that usually, since this is not a full certificate like of ownership, the price is very cheap. It's like you're paying lease on huge lands that the government owns, which gives revenues for the government, but also, it makes sense for things like agriculture, because to buy huge swaths of land is really expensive, and that way you can use it and pay little money to use it. And usually, like, hakuna usaha is like the lowest tier of land ownership, because it can be cancelled, things can change to it, and the government can decide to revoke it. And depending on the deal, you either have an option to be the first person to continue the lease, or they would have to retender. I think this is a lot more micro than you would need, but it's like actually a really fascinating issue that I actually have knowledge about. Yay! Things in the back of my head that I forgot I knew.
Actually, I'm curious though. Based from what you just described, it sounds like incredibly bureaucratic process.
Oh yeah, it's a really bureaucratic process. It used to be that these different companies can just give that right to a company without a tender process, which led to a lot of corruption and all these other issues. There's a lot of corruption in this kind of space and area in general.
Of course, because there's so many steps and so many like people to appease, I guess. I can't imagine this actually promotes longevity of your building plan.
That's why you want a different kind of different kinds of land rights based on what you plan to use it for, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I think I actually also agree with Jokowi in this. Like, I don't think that the government should own the vast majority of land in the country. I think people who work in that place and toilet actually should give ownership, just because like, what does this leave for the people who in that area, right? Like, that they will be forced to just continually become workers for the state land.
Like, dependent on the government all the time.
Dependent on the governmental, and dependent on who the government chooses to give the rights to.
Yeah.
Like, if it's given to a company, then they're just going to be farmers instead of being landowners of their own land.
Yeah.
Which I feel like is more egalitarian and, gives more opportunities to the current generation who work there to actually profit off it long term and create generational wealth for their children, as opposed to become salaried farmers, right?
Yeah.
And you gotta trust people to know what's best for them and their land. Because this is also certificated land that isn't currently owned by, there's so many people, like, living in all parts of Indonesia, just like, oh, I live here, I'm just gonna farm this land, and no one else is there anyway to, like, cultivate it. So, like, for these people, of course, they should have the certificate to the land that they've told for generations. It doesn't make sense to me to continue to have that as government land property, and then suddenly we'll decide to, like, let's parcel this out as a land that we can give to a big company, Like Prabowo said, that makes me somewhat uncomfortable to think about.
And you tell me if I'm wrong. I feel like for a lot of people, the government isn't also very good at telling in rural areas, in remote areas where, like, this is actually government land. So people could have been working this land for generations, and then the government, if they ever choose to suddenly, claim back that land, they could just come in and be like, oh, wait, you didn't know that this is our land? We're taking it back, and we're just, like, going to ruin everything, right? I think that's part of the criticism Jokowi is lobbying to Prabowo, in the terms of, like, you're hoarding land so that you can use it as an upper hand in the future. Like, this is your insurance policy, when in fact, there are people living on those lands who need this as their livelihoods.
And I think that's why the jab Jokowi did was particularly, I think, effective, because I think in a way he does point out the hypocrisy of why Prabowo would want to have the kind of policy that government should continue to have power and owning land, because it kind of benefits people like him and big businesses who will be the ones winning all these tenders for land usage, right? Like,
it was like a clever jab, not only at, like, Prabowo's personality and background, but also actually his policy. So props to Jokowi.
Yeah, I feel like overall he did so much better in this debate.
I guess I just want to also mention, like, it'll be remiss to not mention one funny moment.
The unicorn moment.
When Jokowi was asking Prabowo in the debate, like, how are you going to, Pak Prabowo, how are you going to handle the rise of unicorns in Indonesia? And there was a moment of hesitation where Prabowo was like, unicorns? You mean those online things? And there was like laughter in the room.
Yeah.
And Jokowi was, I gotta say, he was very nice. He was like, he wasn't trying to like amp up the situation. He was like being very polite. He's like, yeah, those online things. And so Prabowo answered. But then it's obvious, right? Like Prabowo doesn't know about the sort of like this next phase of economic development that is around startups, around technology, the unicorns that Jokowi was talking about is, Gojek, Tokopedia, Traveloka and Bukalapak. Like these are huge brand names who have a role to play in the future of Indonesian economy. And the fact that Prabowo doesn't know about unicorns and doesn't know like that terminology is frankly very upsetting to me.
I mean,
not like I want to be like elitist or whatever about like economy, and I don't want to just be like, oh, we can only focus on these super high-techy things and not think about like agriculture or the more traditional kinds of economy.
Right.
But you gotta think forwards, right? You gotta leverage the fact that you have companies like Gojek, like Traveloka, they have a regional presence that have, you should be proud of those companies, right? Like, and then also making sure they're responsible in the way they operate in the space. I just like, Jokowi clearly has a much better grasp at what's going on for the future. I guess that's my takeaway about all of this. Jokowi seems to be someone who has a plan for the future, knowing what the future will be like in terms of the ecosystem. While Prabowo has a plan, but he can't project what the future is really like. He has his plan, and then he will probably just like slap that on to whatever future happens in Indonesia without really thinking about, oh, where are we going as a country?
Yeah, and I think overall, generally, I was really impressed with how Jokowi performed in general. Like, I feel like this is the most eloquent I've seen him in a pretty long time.
Yeah.
And, like, just showed that he was very sharp, Like, he had his wits, his temperament was, like, I feel like he's a boxer that's just, like, light on his feet,
And calm, right? He knew what he was going to say.
He performed like an incumbent president who has worked for the last 4 years really hard and knows his country and knows what he's doing and has a vision towards what he's doing.
Which I guess is obviously a huge step forwards than the last time, these two have come up during the presidential debates, where it was much more, much rawer, right? Like, Jokowi hasn't had 4 years to work on something.
Yeah.
I actually looked up some of their old clips, like, because when I was just like Googling, like, presidential debates, like Google spit out the ones from 2014 when they were doing it the first time around. And it felt like Jokowi has obviously grown and has taken points from the last 4 years to be able to perform better as a candidate, while Prabowo felt a little bit like he was repeating the same things or certainly employing the same tactics. And I think in the future, it'll be interesting to see how Sandi plays a part into how do you update Prabowo into Prabowo 2.0 for 2019.
I actually cannot wait to see the debate between Sandi and Maruf Amin.
1 month's time.
Oh God, that's gonna be
wait for our
hilarious.
hot take. I can't wait for our hot takes there.
That's just gonna be like a slaughter.
That's gonna be brutal.
It's gonna not look that pretty. And I'm here for it. I'm here. I'm ready. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. You can find more information and resources of whatever we talked about on our website, dialogika.id.
Music credits to John Dealey, Lee Roosevelt, and of course, Broke for Free.
If you like what you hear and want to support us, please review our podcast on the Apple Podcast app or whatever app you use to listen to your podcast. And please share our podcast with your friends. It's the best way to spread the word about Dialogika.
If you want to get more involved, we'd love to hear from you. Our email is dialogikapodcast@gmail.com, or just shoot us a message on our Facebook page.
You can also find us on Instagram, YouTube, SoundCloud, and now Twitter. Please follow us in these various platforms. Our Twitter handle is @dialogikapod. Also, follow me on Twitter. It's Steph Tank. That's STEPHTANGK.
Thank you again, and see you guys next time.
Bye!